So this video is part 2 of Chapter 15, Reconstruction in the South. And in the election of 1868, the Republican candidate Ulysses S. Grant, this is our champion Union war general, defeated the Democratic nominee, and his name was Horatio Seymour. And pretty much the reason Grant did win, which he won very narrowly, but he won because Southern blacks had been given the right to vote under the Reconstruction Act. And so that is what gave him the edge with the popular vote. And if you remember, we talked about the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction Acts that gave Southern blacks the right to vote. But radicals wanted to guarantee blacks that right in every state, despite the unpopularity of that idea. So Congress passed the 15th Amendment, and this forbade any state to deny the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so this amendment was passed in March of 1870 and added to the Constitution. So during the Reconstruction era, former slaves had actual political influence. They voted, they held office, they exercised the rights that were guaranteed to them by the 14th Amendment. But by and large, black office holders weren't numerous and they weren't like super influential. The real rulers of the Black Republican Reconstruction or the Black Republican governments were the scalawags. And you've probably heard that term before, but this just refers to the Southern whites who cooperated with the Republicans, who were primarily a Northern party. And so again, the scalawags were Southern whites who cooperated with the Republicans. And also the carpetbaggers, who were the Northerners who went down to the South for idealistic reasons. They wanted to make a difference in the South, or they may have been searching for opportunities. But they were named for the carpetbags that they carried with them from the North. At any rate, blacks failed to dominate the Southern governments because they generally lacked political experience. A lot of times they were poor, they were uneducated, and almost everywhere they were a minority. So they really didn't hold that great of an influence. Those blacks who did hold office tended to be better educated and tended to have more money than most Southern blacks, and many of them had actually been freed before the war. Most of the black office holders proved to be able and conscientious public servants. Some were incompetent and some were corrupt, and in that little distinguished them from the whites who were corrupt in government. So radical Southern governments with the Freedmen's Bureau and the philanthropic organizations did a lot of work in rebuilding the South and worked hard to expand social services and educational opportunities for whites and blacks. The ravaged land. So the South's economic problems after the war complicated the rebuilding of its political systems. And although in the long run, abolition of slavery, of course, was a great thing, the immediate effect was chaos. Thaddeus Stevens was the leading proponent of confiscating white Southern property and distributing it to freed slaves. The problem with that, though, is establishing ex-slaves on small farms without the proper tools, seeds, and other necessities would have done them no good. But on the other hand, without the redistribution of land, former slaves were confined to the established framework of Southern agriculture. So this was really a chaotic time. Southern whites thought that blacks were incapable of providing for themselves as independent farmers. So overall, productivity declined. And it wasn't because blacks could not work independently. For one, blacks just chose not to work like slaves anymore. And for example, they didn't force their children out into the fields at 2 and 3 years old. So immediately after the Civil War, Southern planters attempted to farm their lands with gang labor, and they would use ex-slaves and give them low wages for gang labor. And this system really didn't work because it reminded the slaves of slavery and because capital was scarce. And so this led to sharecropping and the crop lien system. So sharecropping was an alternative to gang labor. And sharecropping is simply a system of agriculture where a landowner allows a tenant to use the land in return for a share of the crops produced on that land. And so sharecropping gave blacks more control over their lives, and it gave them the hope of someday earning enough money to buy a small farm. Of course, few actually managed to buy their own farms, and that was in part because of white resistance to blacks owning land. But many white farmers in the South were also trapped by the sharecropping system. So this was affected the South universally, or the poor in the South universally. So because money or capital was so scarce, it led to the development of the crop lien system. And this really locked Southern agriculture into the cultivation of cash crops only. And so the crop lien system is a system where farmers with little or no money would borrow cash to live off of during the year. And after their harvest, farmers would then turn over their harvests to the merchants who had loaned them the money. So they were loaning cash and paying back in crops. And so that was the crop lien system. Unfortunately, compared to the rest of the country, the South's economy grew slowly after the Civil War, and its share of the national output of manufactured goods declined sharply during the Reconstruction era as the sharecropping system and the crop lien system proliferated. White backlash. So in order to check black political power, dissenting Southerners began to form secret terrorist societies. And of course, the most notorious of these societies was the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. And they formed in 1866 as a social club, and they soon became a vigilante group that was completely dedicated to driving blacks out of politics. And the Klan spread rapidly throughout the South. Congress tried to attack the Klan with 3 Force Acts, which basically put elections under federal jurisdiction and punished anyone convicted of interfering with any citizen's right to vote. So by 1872, federal authorities had pretty much broken the power of the Klan. And this whole experience, though, demonstrated the effectiveness of terrorism and keeping blacks away from the polls, and how paramilitary organizations began to adopt the same tactics that the Klan had used and then had been forced to abandon by Congress. At any rate, conservative parties began to take over Southern governments, and terrorism and intimidation really only account for a part of that development. The other part was that the North was unwilling to intervene. Sectional reconciliation had been going on forever, it seemed like, and the North just lost interest in policing the South. So Grant as president, and this is the same General Ulysses S. Grant who forced Lee to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse just like 3 years before he was elected. So Grant really failed to live up to his expectations as president. He was a poor executive. He was just honestly naive, and it made him the dupe of unscrupulous friends and schemers. And so his administration was completely wrought with scandal, and he failed to deal effectively with economic problems, with social problems, and like I said, corruption plagued his administration. And Grant didn't cause or participate in the scandals that disgraced his administration, but he really didn't do anything to prevent them either. And so in 1872, Republican reformers who were alarmed by the rumors of corruption in Grant's administration and by his failure to press for civil service reform formed the Liberal Republican Party and nominated Horace Greeley for president. The Democrats also nominated Greeley, but Grant defeated him. So even though Grant's administration seemed to be nothing but scandal, he managed to be a two-termer. And if you Google him even now, that's almost always what comes up is the scandals that took place during his administration. And so that brings us to the election of 1876. In this election, the Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrats chose Samuel Tilden. And early election returns indicated that Tilden led the race. In Florida and South Carolina and Louisiana, where Republican regimes still held power, Republicans used their control of election machinery to invalidate Democratic votes and to declare Hayes the winner in those states. So in January 1877, Congress created an electoral commission to make a decision on the disputed elections. And so the Republican majority on the commission awarded the disputed votes to Hayes, the Republican candidate. So the Compromise of 1877, many of the Southern Democrats were willing to accept Hayes if he would promise to remove the federal troops from the South and allow the Southern states to manage their own internal affairs. And so once in office, Hayes honored most of the elements of the compromise. So Hayes won the election and promised to remove the troops from the South. And this is pretty much what the Compromise of 1877 consisted of. He removed the last troops from South Carolina and Louisiana in April of 1877, and he appointed a former Confederate general, David Key, as Postmaster General. That's like the chief executive of the post office. But the alliance of ex-Whigs and Northern Republicans that produced this compromise did not last. The South, of course, remained solidly Democratic. The Compromise of 1877, though, did mark the end of the Reconstruction era and the recognition of a new political order in the South.